Another question that often comes up is the question of Jewish burial practices. And there appears to be a lot of confusion on this issue. Part of the confusion comes from the fact that the scriptures themselves are confusing, in that John 19:40 says that Jesus was bound in strips. And so this suggests that Jesus was wound like some kind of a mummy. Well, that's not the way the Jews did it. And in fact, even the Egyptians didn't do it by the time the first century rolled around. Now, the other thing, the other three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, don't mention strips. They just mention the fact that Jesus is wrapped in a linen cloth or a linen shroud. So only John mentions strips. And so how are we going to reconcile this apparent contradiction? Well, one of the things we find from the story of the raising of Lazarus was that he was bound hand and foot, wearing his grave clothes. We know that there were strips of linen used to bind the wrists, to bind the ankles, to bind the chin, and so there were probably also strips of linen bound around the outside of the cloth itself. In fact, I wanted to reference a book I have here. It's called The Jewish Way of Death and Mourning, and I'll just read you just something right out of here. It says, "The Jewish tradition recognizes the democracy of death. It therefore demands that all Jews be buried in the same type of garment, which is a simple white shroud." The way that the Jews would intern their dead was that there would be multiple burial garments. And if you were to die by normal death, in other words, there would perhaps be like a tunic or a cloak where the head is here, comes out here, and it goes down to the floor, and there's no pockets and no sleeves. And then there would be another cloth, probably the Jewish talit, or the prayer cloth, which is over the face, and then wrapped in a third cloth, which would be the long linen burial shroud. And now, in the case of Jesus, we see, or at least with the Shroud of Turin, we see a single linen shroud. We do not see multiple cloths. In fact, the image that we see on the shroud appears to be an image of a naked man. This is interesting. Now, because there is a distinction of how the Jews bury their dead based on how a person dies, whether it's by normal death or by violent death. Now, again, from this same book, The Jewish Way of Death and Mourning, here's what happens in violent death. It says, "Where the deceased died through violence or accident, and his body and garments are completely spattered with blood, no washing or tahara is performed. The body is placed in the casket without the clothes being removed. Only a sheet is wrapped around it over the clothes. The blood is part of the body and may not be separated from it in death." So as I would tell an audience in a shroud encounter, you live in Tel Aviv. You're Jewish. You get into a horrible car wreck. You're dead. You're covered with blood. And guess what's going to happen? They're not going to remove the clothes. They're not going to wash your body. They're going to simply wrap you in a single linen shroud, and you'll be in the ground that day. That's Jewish tradition now, and it was then as well. And again, we have the image on the shroud of an image of apparently, certainly, a man who died by violent death. My gosh, there's blood all over the shroud, crown of thorns, scourging all over the body, wound in the side, nails in the wrist, nails in the feet. I mean, certainly this man died a violent death, yet he's naked. Now, why naked? Well, what did they cast lots for, according to the scripture? His clothes. So it stands to reason that he would have been naked. This is very important. So if there's a lot of confusion that stems from John 19:40, where John says he was bound in strips. That only appears in John, and it only relates to strips of linen binding the wrists, binding the ankles, binding the head. Jewish tradition is to use a single linen shroud.